Ever been in one of those brainstorming sessions, where it feels like the creativity is just not flowing, like everyone's kind of stuck?
Oh, absolutely. Happens all the time.
Yeah, and it's frustrating, right? Because there's potential for something amazing, but it's like you just can't quite tap into it.
It's like trying to start a fire with wet wood. You know you need a spark, but it's just not happening.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And that's what we're diving into today, how to unlock that collective creativity, that magic that happens when people work together and come up with something truly innovative.
And, it's interesting because we often think of creativity as this individual thing, right? Like you either have it or you don't.
Right, right. You're born with it or you're not.
But the sources we're looking at today, they really challenge that assumption.
Okay, so let's set the stage here. We've got two really insightful sources for this deep dive.
Yeah, and they kind of approach this idea of collective creativity from different angles, which I think is really cool.
Totally. So first up, we've got Linda Hill, who, if you don't know, is like a rock star in the world of organizational creativity. She's a professor at Harvard Business School, and she spent years studying some of the most innovative companies out there.
Yeah, she's like the go-to expert on how to actually build a culture of creativity.
Exactly. And her TEDx talk from 2014, How to Manage for Collective Creativity, it's like a masterclass in this stuff.
I mean, she's literally studied companies like Pixar, IDEO, Google, you name it. So we're talking about real-world insights here, not just theoretical fluff.
And then to complement that, we've got this other great piece that delves into the why behind collective creativity. Like, why is it so important, especially in today's world? What's the business case for it?
And it's surprisingly compelling. I mean, it goes beyond just the feel-good stuff, like teamwork makes the dream work.
Right, right. It actually makes sense from a strategic standpoint, which is really interesting.
Absolutely. And when you understand the why, it gives you even more motivation to actually implement the how, which is what Linda Hill is so brilliant at.
Totally. Okay, so let's start with Hill's central argument, because I think it's so important, and frankly, it's really refreshing. She's basically saying that everyone has creative potential.
Yes. I love that she starts there. It's like she's giving everyone permission to be creative.
Exactly. And I think that's so important because so often we get caught up in this idea that, oh, I'm not the creative type.
Right, like creativity is this mystical gift that some people are just born with, but Hill's research shows that's just not true.
And it's not just about, being able to paint a picture or write a song, right? It's about problem solving, coming up with new ideas, looking at things from a different perspective.
Exactly. It's a skill, and like any skill, it can be developed.
Okay, so if we all have this potential, then the question becomes, how do we unlock it, right? Especially in a team or organizational setting.
And that's where Hill's research gets really interesting, because she's not just saying, oh, just be more creative. She actually lays out some really specific tools and tactics that leaders can use to foster a culture of creativity.
And what's so great is that she illustrates these with real-world examples from those companies she studied.
Right. So we're not just talking about some abstract theory here.
Yeah.
These are things that have actually worked in some of the most innovative organizations in the world.
Exactly. And one of the things that really struck me from her talk is this idea that it's not just about having a bunch of creative people in a room together.
Right. It's not like some magical formula where you just throw a bunch of artists and musicians and writers together and suddenly, boom, you've got innovation.
Exactly. It's about creating the right environment, the right system where that creativity can flourish.
And one of the key ingredients in that system, according to Hill, is something she calls creative abrasion.
Okay, creative abrasion. That sounds a little intense.
It does, doesn't it? But it's actually really fascinating. Basically, it's this idea that you need a certain amount of friction, of healthy debate and disagreement to really spark new ideas.
Oh, okay. So it's not about everyone just agreeing with each other all the time?
Definitely not. In fact, Hill argues that too much harmony can actually stifle creativity.
Interesting.
Yeah, because when everyone's on the same page, you tend to get a lot of incremental thinking, just building on existing ideas. But when you have people who are willing to challenge each other's assumptions, to poke holes in each other's ideas, that's where the really breakthrough thinking happens.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this works. So you're saying that a little bit of conflict can actually be a good thing for creativity.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's not just about conflict for the sake of conflict, right? It's about creating a culture where people feel safe to disagree, where they know that their ideas will be heard and respected, even if they're not immediately embraced.
And that's where leadership comes in, right? Because it takes a skilled leader to create that kind of environment where people feel comfortable taking risks and voicing their opinions, even if they're different from the group.
Absolutely. And that's something that Hill talks about a lot in her work, how to create a culture of psychological safety where people feel like they can be themselves and share their ideas without fear of judgment or reprisal.
And I imagine that's even more important in today's world where things are changing so rapidly and companies need to be able to adapt and innovate constantly.
Absolutely. Because if you don't have that culture of psychological safety, people are going to be afraid to speak up, to share their ideas, and you're going to miss out on all that potential creativity.
So it's not just about the individual's ability to be creative. It's about creating a system, a culture that supports and encourages that creativity.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to dive into in more detail as we continue this deep dive.
So we've talked about Linda Hill's perspective, but our second source takes this whole idea of collective creativity and really digs into the why.
Right. Like, why is this even more important now than ever?
Exactly. And they make a really compelling argument that it all comes down to problem solving.
Totally. They're saying that diverse perspectives are key to coming up with truly innovative solutions.
And it makes sense, right? Like, if everyone in the room has the same background, the same way of looking at the world, you're going to be much more limited in your thinking.
It's like that old saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You need different tools in your toolbox to solve complex problems.
I like that. And this source gives a really cool example about engineers. Like, imagine you've got a team of engineers, all super smart, but they all specialize in the same thing.
Right, they're all mechanical engineers, or they all have experience in a particular type of software.
Exactly. So they're going to approach a problem with a very specific mindset, a certain set of assumptions.
And those assumptions might be totally valid, but they can also blind you to other possibilities.
Right. So if you bring in someone with a completely different perspective, maybe they're a chemical engineer or they have a background in psychology, suddenly you're opening up a whole new world of potential solutions.
Absolutely. And this source points out that it's not just about the ideas themselves, it's also about the process of collaboration.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, they're saying that when people feel like they're part of a team, when their voices are heard and their contributions are valued, it actually boosts their motivation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like if you feel like you're just a cog in the machine, you're not going to be as invested in the outcome.
Exactly. But when you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself, when you feel a sense of ownership over the work, you're going to be way more likely to go the extra mile.
So it's not just about the ideas themselves. It's about creating an environment where people feel empowered to contribute their best work.
Exactly. And that leads to better outcomes for everyone involved. This source also emphasizes that collaboration can actually build trust within a team.
Oh, that's huge, especially in today's world where remote work and virtual teams are becoming more and more common.
Absolutely. It's so easy to feel disconnected when you're not physically in the same space. But when you're working together towards a common goal, it creates a sense of shared purpose and camaraderie.
And that trust then spills over into other areas like communication and collaboration, which further enhances the team's overall effectiveness.
It's like a positive feedback loop. And to really drive home the importance of all of this source actually quotes Howard Gardner, the famous psychologist who came up with the theory of multiple intelligences.
Yeah, I love his work. What does he have to say about this?
Well, he says, and I quote, "Creativity is a combination of a culture of innovation and an individual's capacity to take that culture and do something original with it."
That's powerful. So it's not just about individual talent or brilliance. It's about creating an environment, a culture where that creativity can thrive.
Exactly. And this source goes on to say that fostering that kind of culture is essential for any organization that wants to stay ahead of the curve in today's rapidly changing world.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we build a culture of innovation? Because it sounds great in theory, but I imagine it's not always easy to put into practice.
You're absolutely right. It's not a quick fix, but this source does offer some really practical advice.
Like what? Give me some actionable tips.
Well, they emphasize the importance of open communication, first and foremost.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But what does that look like in practice? Is it just about having more meetings?
Not necessarily. It's more about creating a space where people feel comfortable sharing their ideas, even if they're half-baked, even if they go against the grain.
So it's about creating a culture where it's safe to take risks, to make mistakes, and to learn from each other.
Exactly. And that's where leadership comes in, because it takes a conscious effort from leaders at all levels to foster that kind of environment.
So we've covered a lot of ground here about unlocking that collective genius.
Yeah. It really is amazing when you think about all the different factors that come into play.
Right, like it's not just about having one creative genius in the room anymore.
Not at all. It's about tapping into the collective wisdom and experience of the entire team.
Exactly. And creating that environment where those sparks can fly.
And where those creative abrasions can happen.
Okay, speaking of creative abrasions, before we wrap up this deep dive, I gotta ask.
Yeah, what's on your mind?
Well, we've been focusing on all the positives of collective creativity.
Right, the benefits of collaboration and diverse perspectives.
Exactly. But are there any potential downsides? Like, is there ever a point where too many cooks in the kitchen can actually backfire?
Oh, that's such a good question. Because, yeah, like anything else, there can definitely be too much of a good thing.
Right. Like, what happens when you've got a team that's overflowing with ideas, but they're all going in different directions?
Totally. Or what if those creative abrasions turn into, like, full-blown arguments?
Exactly. So how do you find that balance?
Well, that's where strong leadership becomes even more crucial.
Okay, so you need someone to kind of wrangle all those creative energies and channel them in a productive direction.
Precisely. It's about creating a clear vision and setting boundaries while still allowing for that freedom of expression and exploration.
So it's like walking a tightrope between structure and chaos.
In a way, yes. You need enough structure to provide direction and focus, but not so much that it stifles creativity.
Makes sense. It's like finding that sweet spot where the magic really happens.
Exactly. And it's interesting because this whole conversation has really got me thinking about how these principles apply not just to work, but to life in general.
Oh, totally. Like think about planning a family vacation.
Right. Everyone's got their own ideas, their own priorities.
And if you don't have a way to channel those different perspectives, it can easily turn into a disaster.
Exactly. But if you can create that space for open communication, for healthy debate, for creative abrasion.
You might just end up with the most amazing, memorable vacation ever.
Exactly, because you've tapped into the collective genius of the group.
I love that. So it's not just about work, it's about relationships, it's about problem solving in all areas of life.
Absolutely. It's about harnessing the power of human connection and collaboration.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into collective creativity.
It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you about this.
Likewise. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this journey.
We hope this deep dive has sparked some new ideas and inspired you to unleash your own collective genius.
And remember, it doesn't matter if you're an artist, an engineer, or just someone who wants to tap into the power of collaboration.
The potential for collective creativity exists within all of us.
We just have to create the space for it to flourish.
So go out there and make some magic together.
Until next time, keep those creative sparks flying.